Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kara McNamara. I'm the Communications Manager at Catholic Prison Ministries Coalition, and we're so glad to have all of you here with us today. Our town hall is entitled Why Ministry, and we're so grateful to have two wonderful speakers, Sister Susan and Sister Misty, to lead us in this discussion with plenty of opportunity for questions and reflections from all of you on the call as well. But to begin our time together, I wanted to share a prayer called We Are One With You by Thomas Merton. Oh God, we are one with you. You have made us one with you. You have taught us that if we are open to one another, you dwell in us. Help us to preserve this openness and to fight for it with all our hearts. Help us to realize that there can be no understanding where there is mutual rejection. Oh God, in accepting one another wholeheartedly, fully, completely, we accept you and we thank you and we adore you and we love you with our whole being, because our being is your being. Our spirit is rooted in your spirit. Fill us then with love and let us be bound together with love as we go our diverse ways, united in this one spirit, which makes you present in the world and which makes you witness to the ultimate reality that is love. Love has overcome. Love is victorious. Amen.
Amen.
Now I'd like to turn it over to CPMC Executive Coordinator Karen Clifton, who will introduce our speakers today.
Thank you, Kara. We are so glad to have you on this call and really appreciate you taking the time. We've had a lot of information over the course of the year shared with us on our town halls and in our webinars. And we wanted to take the time to build community, to have an opportunity to look back on the many blessings over the year with gratitude, but also an opportunity to look forward and share with hope for the coming year. So thank you so much we are so grateful to have Sister Susan Van Baalen and Sister Misty Garriga with us here to be able to lead us in this process of sharing. And we want you to, if there's something that pops up, just urgently that you want to interject, please put it in the chat. But otherwise, we'll open it up in the end and Sister Misty will lead us in a sharing process for all of us that are on this call. So we are grateful for the vast experience that Sister Susan Van Baalen brings to this call. Sister Susan has been in prison ministry since 1972. She started as a volunteer and then became employed in 1980. And from there, she has, her resume was more than, it would take the entire half of this program here with her 4 pages of honorary doctorates and all of her publications and the vast experience that she has in leadership in spending many years as head of the Federal Bureau of Prisons over all of the chaplains. So we are so grateful for her gift of wisdom she has given us over the last several webinars that she's been part of, but also just being part of our executive committee for Catholic Prison Ministries Coalition. And so in from 2008 to 2013, I think that was a lot of her serving in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And then she left that in 2013 and moved to her congregation, where she has, from that time to 2022 till just recently, been working with their development. But she is engaging in a new ministry as of now and focusing on her fellow sisters that are in institutional confinement and their latter years of life. So it's a new ministry, but all continuous, as we know, all the different facets of ministry through the course of life. And we're so grateful to have you here, Susan. And Sister Misty has been a joy to get to know. She is a sister of the Divine Province, and she was originally from San Antonio before she entered the convent, and where she taught math for 11 years. And I think a lot of her preparation came from doing design in middle school and high school teaching, because those are some rough years. So I'm impressed. She has a master's in spirituality from Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio and serves now as the diocesan director for ministry in Beaumont, which those of you that are Texans or on this call, you know that this is the home for death row. So that is part of the story that she will share with us today, which is powerful. So ladies, you are such a gift to all of us that are on this call. And I'm going to turn it over to you. Sister Susan is initially a teacher, so we are in good hands. Sister Susan, you want to lead us off?
Okay, thank you very much, and it's really nice to be here. I feel like I'm recreating something that I did in the last century. But I'm going to talk about two things. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about the similarities and differences between Sister Misty's ministry and mine, and of course a really important one is that she's doing it in the 21st century. And although I ended up in the 21st century, I started doing it, as Karen said, in 1972 as a volunteer. But when I looked at our backgrounds, I saw some things that were similar that I think may have facilitated our call to prison ministry. Mine, of course, was very different from Misty's. So we were both prepared for this ministry through a previous ministry in middle school and high school, and also ministry in the church. We came up in the church, you might say, as some people say. I came up in the church. And the other thing is that in education, both of us seem to find, maybe I articulated it more than she did, that working with high school kids is not a whole lot different than working with inmates. And maybe you all have found that working with inmates, that sometimes their trouble starts when they've been bullied in the 6th or 7th grade because they can't read or they can't do the math, or because they have a little bit of a disfigurement, or because they're maybe a little bit too fat or a little bit too shy or whatever. And so that seemed to be very similar. And though similar in many ways, our correctional ministries, and I prefer to call them redemptive ministries, are quite similar, but most importantly, they are quite different. And that is that Sister Misty is an official representative of the Catholic Diocese of, I think this is right, Houston, Galveston. Is that correct?
Beaumont.
Pardon?
In Beaumont, just next door to Houston.
Oh, sorry. So in the Diocese of Beaumont, Texas. And though I was first employed by the Diocese of Lansing, Michigan in 1980, 27 and a half years of my 28 years were spent as an official representative, not of the church, but as an official representative of the state of Michigan or the federal government, and an employee of theirs. And in that capacity, I had two primary responsibilities that make my ministry different. First of all, I had the commission to protect the First Amendment right of freedom of religion for inmates of all faiths, not just for Catholics, but for inmates of all faiths. And secondly, I had the responsibility to minister to people of all faiths. And although that's a wonderful ministry, it's a little more challenging than walking into something new, than walking into something that you already know about. I have to say that one of the things that I learned very quickly is that every chaplain comes with some kind of an official degree and official commission from a church, but they know very little about the other 28 or 30 churches that are represented in the inmate population. And so there's really a lot to learn about the concept of one truth, many paths, if you have the privilege of being called to prison ministry. And the other thing that I want to mention in the introduction is that there is a high need for the Catholic Church to be represented in redemptive ministry in both of these arenas, both as Catholic representative or as a representative, as a representative of the government protecting the religious rights of all inmates. That the Catholics are pretty able to do that, and I believe it's because of Vatican II, that the Catholics are pretty able to do that compared or more easily than people of other faiths. And if we could bring up the 10 tips now, we'll take a look at these 10 tips. These are things that I learned in prison that I hope might facilitate or help you in ministry. The first one is that related to this morning's scripture reading, where Isaiah is reminding us to cast a broad tent. And what we need to remember there is that Jesus never turned anyone away, and he was criticized for that. And so I'm not going to read through these, but I'll give a couple of examples as we go through. And I have arranged to have these sent to you, to anyone who is registered. Do not compromise your values for the sake of the institution. And I would say there that it's very easy, it's so incredibly easy to burn out. And the burnout might, or very often begins with your compromise of values. Well, I could just do this little thing or this little thing. Also, I think it's very important to give yourself permission to think about other things and do other things when you're not working. And this again is to avoid burnout. And I have to tell you that I was the victim of burnout after 7 years in prison ministry. I went home and set the garbage bag that I had emptied my desk, from which I had emptied my desk, and I set it on the floor on the next to the sofa, and it sat there for 7 months before I ever even touched it. And it took me that whole 7 months to begin to start over, to begin to recognize that I was that I was called to this ministry and needed to find a way to catch balance. Another thing that I think is very important is to remember your status. There are some people in CPM that are volunteers. There are others that are contract ministers. There are others that are employed by institutions to be the chaplain. And so it's very, very important that you kind of remember that you're ministering to every person in that institution, and that you have to be very diligent about your boundaries. And again, depending on whether or not you are, you never surrender your right to access to inmates. But that's always within your status. For example, I'll just use this as an example. A volunteer ordinarily cannot go over to the special housing unit or to the hole. But those with contracting, those who are contracted and those who are paid staff do have that opportunity. And sometimes it's your responsibility to escort the volunteer. Now, I have to tell you a story, and that is that I was at the prison in at the federal prison in Florence, Colorado, where the worst of the worst are supposed to be confined. And I went to talk to an inmate who happened to be a Catholic, but it didn't matter. And I had to be escorted there. It's in a dungeon, it's underground, and I had to be escorted there. And the officer who accompanied me continued to stand next to me, and I said, "Excuse me, but we have a right, a constitutional right to privacy here." And I had to ask him to step away. And when he didn't step away, I asked the officer at the building to please contact the warden for me. And that gives you an example. You have to make yourself, in a way, indispensable. Make yourself so valuable to the institution that they want you there in every crisis, whether it's a religious crisis, a spiritual crisis, or a riot. But you have to make yourself indispensable. And you'll make mistakes. There was a time when I was walking the line at a hostage situation, and I was walking the line protecting the visiting the staff to see if they needed anything and all of this stuff. I was wearing this big jacket with special letters on it that said I was a first responder. And all of a sudden there was an FBI guy walking behind me, and he said, "Sister, you're too close to the door where the gun is." The inmates had a gun, and they were threatening to use it. And he said, "Sister, you're too close to the door where the gun is." But he recognized at the same time my right to be there. The next one is to make yourself, sorry, I talked about that already, is to stay in your lane. And it's the longer you're there, the harder it becomes to stay in your lane. But remember that if you are a contractor or a volunteer, you have access to every inmate in the institution, anywhere in the institution, whether he's in the chapel or whether he's in the dormitory or in the workplace or in the rec yard, or even if he is in segregation. Keep the rules or live with the consequences, and the consequence is unemployment. The hardest thing for me to do as a chief chaplain was to escort chaplains out of the building because they brought a guy tennis shoes. What could be the problem with bringing a guy tennis shoes? His brother dropped them off and I just brought them to him. That's all I did. With no sense of the fact that there were drugs under the insole. I just brought them in. That's all I did. Or the chaplain who had pornography, child pornography on his computer, on his work computer. It's very, very, very hard to face the consequences of unemployment. And I was sued by a chaplain because I would not let him have open carry across state lines, where law enforcement people are allowed to have open carry across state lines. It's a federal law. And I would not allow him to, because he was non-combatant, and because he was a non-combatant, he could not claim law enforcement privilege of carrying a weapon. Another thing that's very important is not to proselytize. We sometimes think that, it kind of like exists in prison, I mean, it exists in each person, that our religion is the right religion, or we wouldn't belong to it. And I don't know what your religions are. I'm assuming most of you are probably Catholic, but whatever your religion, it's right, and it's right for you, and it always has been. But there's an inclination sometimes to try to convince other people that your religion is the best. But prison is not the place to do that. Make clear to your parish or whoever is asking you to represent them in the prison that you are not there to evangelize. And the only way you evangelize is by your presence and by your compassion. You're not by words, because again, you'll be escorted out. And I put this 10th one on as an example of that, and that is that I had an inmate come to me wanting a green rosary. Had to be green, and it had to be a rosary, and I gave it to him. And he put it around his neck. And my first inclination, I was fairly new at the job, my first inclination was to take the rosary away from him and say, this is a sacramental of the church, and you can't wear it around your neck. That's not what it's used for. But I had been there long enough to realize that this was if I can use the term, sacramental for him. This was a very, very important part of his religion, which was Santerian. And in the Santerian tradition, they wear the rosary around the neck, and they wear it for protection. But they also have a color. Each one has their own Orisha, their own god, and that green is a connection to their God, to their experience of God, I should say, not to God, but to their experience of God. And so I had to remember that. And you know, the rosaries that we give inmates, by and large, are not blessed. And then the inmates may ask to have them blessed. But it doesn't matter. Also, it's not a sacramental unless it's blessed. Remember that too, that the beads in the string are not a sacramental in and of themselves. They become a sacramental when they're blessed by the church. So I use that as another example. And the last example I want to give you, and then I will conclude, is the example of taking a Monsignor to visit. No, pardon me, I changed that one. I had a woman convert to Catholicism, and after she converted to Catholicism, she wanted to be confirmed. And so I arranged for the bishop to come for a confirmation. And she had been in prison for a heinous crime ever since she was the age of 15. She was also emotionally and developmentally challenged. So anyway, Janet was being was being confirmed, and the Bishop of Lansing came to confirm her. And there were two things about the bishop that were especially profound to me. One is that the inmates couldn't walk up to communion because they were all of mixed security levels. So he went around to every person and gave them communion, anyone who wanted it. He didn't ever say, only Catholics may receive this. You're only invited to receive this if you're Roman Catholic and baptized. And so he didn't say any of that. But when it was all over, he brought Janet up to the front of the group, and he said to Janet, "Now, Janet, is there something special you'd like to have or do on the day of your confirmation?" And she looked up at him and she said, "Yes, Bishop." And he said, "And what is that?" And she said, "Could I wear your hat for a minute?" And he removed his mitre and he put the mitre on her head and handed her his crozier and said, "Sister, maybe we could have a picture of this." And to me, that was profound ministry of redemption. And so I'll end right there.
Thank you, Sister Susan. Thank you for sharing your years and your wealth of knowledge and ministry through the years for us. And so, Misty, I ask you to.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Oh no, it's a joy, and I can see how those stories they ministered to you through the course of all these years, and it is every time you go in, there's always an amazing experience that just reminds you of the presence of God. So thank you, Sister Misty.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My career in criminal justice is only about 2 years old now. I was doing work at the diocese with multi-parish ministries previously, and then we had a new bishop, and he pulled me in his office and he said, "Would you consider being the criminal justice director?" And I said, "Excuse me?" I wasn't quite sure what all of that entailed, but I wanted to share just a few key insights that I've learned in these last 2 years. Now, it's really been in the last year that I've had the majority of my one-on-one experience and encounters with the inmates here in Texas. Our diocese covers 9 counties. In our diocese, I am over the 10 state units that are in our area, as well as the federal complex that is here in Beaumont. And a couple of our units are an hour and a half away. So it involves a lot of volunteers in order for this whole thing to work properly. One thing that I'm able to do is really work with the priests and the ministers who are so willing to go into these prisons. I've spent a lot of time in reflection this last year or so, and I've come to understand the gift of seeing their humanity. You know, these men and women they've made some bad choices, they've been caught, but I've also come to understand that a lot of these men and women did not have a shot to begin with for a positive life. They did not have the opportunities that we've had. They've not had the support. They've been abused. There's just so many major factors in their life that was probably part of the reason why they are where they are. But that doesn't mean that their humanity is any less than yours or mine. And as an educator, that's been one of the biggest awarenesses that I've been trying to instill in the people that I share this with, that I come in contact with. And one story in particular that I wanted to share today with, I have many in this short two-year span that I've had in this ministry. But one in particular, as was stated, we have death row in this diocese, and it's up in Livingston. And when I first came, the only thing I knew about death row was the list of people on it, that the previous directors would always write a Christmas card to the inmates and send it off. So I knew that much. But it wasn't until the beginning of this year when I was contacted from an advocacy group from one of the inmates requesting to receive sacraments, and how he had been preparing with another parish in Dallas. And I was so overwhelmed. Now, to say I was overwhelmed is really an understatement when the bishop asked me to do this. And thank goodness we were in COVID, because the first year I spent trying to learn the vocabulary, trying to understand where these places were. I didn't know what a halfway house was before I started this. So there were so many pieces of this whole environment that I was just drinking from a fire hose, trying to understand and remember and become part of. And I looked at the date because the advocacy group reached out and said he has a date, he's to be executed. And so I looked at the date. Now, this was in January of this year, when I was first contacted. And I looked at the date and I realized his execution date was in August. And at that moment in time, I was up to here. I was trying to keep everything together. And I said, okay, I have time. And one thing that, days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. And later on, I heard from the guy again and received correspondence from the gentleman on death row, and his name was Kasul. And so Kasul and I started to correspond. One of my deacons that started his prison ministry about 3 years ago, one of his ministries is to go every Friday and visit death row. So he knew of Kasul. I relied heavily on this deacon to help me out. And over the next couple of months, we started to try to figure out a plan, how we were going to get a priest in there to do the sacraments, because as Susan so well shared, there's so many obstacles. And if you're in prison ministry, there's so many obstacles just to try to get in and to get the sacraments in, and all of the little sacramentals that you have to bring. It's overwhelming. And so fast forward till about May, and the end of May, my bishop and I, along with Deacon Steve, who was the one who walks death row, went to visit death row. I'd never been, didn't know what to expect. I had this image of what it was going to look like, what it was going to sound like, the images. And when I got there, they asked us to put a bulletproof vest on. So that was a little shocking. So I did that. Bishop and I donned our bulletproof vests. And having been in all the other units, I was never uncomfortable at all. I was never scared or anything to go in. And when the doors shut at the front there of death row, that was the first time I kind of jerked a little bit, thinking, oh boy, what did I just do? So it was Bishop and I's first time, and I had talked to him about this gentleman on our way up to Livingston. So it was a good hour and a half drive. He and I talked about it, and we were trying to figure out maybe how we could do it, eventually. And so we get there, and I was told I was not going to be able to go to the actual cell because the deacon, who is a CVCA and able to go in, was the one escorting us. But I had to stay back behind the first set of gates, which I was very disappointed in. Well, lo and behold, we get there, and there happened to be an officer who escorted us. And so I was hanging back a little bit, and he said, oh, ma'am, you can come in with us. You can go to the cell. And I thought, wow, okay. So I walked up to the cell with the other two guys, with Bishop and Deacon, and to see them face to face, to know their names on a piece of paper, and to see who they were behind this little bitty, like 2 foot by 6 inch glass window, not glass, but steel, where all you could have is fingertips in the mesh of the metal. There was an overwhelming sense of, I'm seeing God present right in front of me. So I'm just trying to take it all in, and we get to the cell of Kasul, and Kasul was telling Bishop his desires, and Bishop, as any good bishop would say, we have the baptism of desire, and it doesn't matter whether you're innocent or guilty. What's going to matter is that Christ is with you now, and to not worry about your eternal life, that if you want it, God will grant that. So we're talking, and he turns around, and we're walking off, and Bishop looks at me and says, well, can we baptize him now? I said, well, you're the bishop, you can do whatever you want to. So this happened to be officer was one of the kind officers, and he fetched us a bottle of water. We went back to this cell of Kasul, and Bishop baptized him right there in his cell. At that point, I was a little bit weak in the knees because I wasn't quite sure what was happening. We move on to the next set of rooms, and some of the inmates we were talking to were talking about, this isn't death row, this is life row. We're not dead yet. And they have a faith-based pod there on death row. And these men, I thought I was going to see doom and gloom and hopelessness and sadness and despair. And it was far from that. I saw men who had hope. I saw men who showed gratitude, who were grateful that we had a bishop, a deacon, and a nun visiting them one-on-one. And they recognized that. And at one point, one whole row of inmates stopped and started singing to us. And they had been practicing. Now, they can't see one another, but somehow they communicate and figure out the words to it. But they sang to us, "Blessed are they who are poor in spirit. Theirs is the kingdom of God. We are the light of the world." And they sang that. And at this point, I'm even weaker in the knees, and the three of us have tears in our eyes. And up until that point in my ministry, it wasn't that I doubted that this is where I was supposed to be, but it was so overwhelming. All of the details of coordinating 10 different units in the federal unit and trying to get back in COVID and coordinating all these volunteers and even retreats that we were starting to go have back in the prisons. It wasn't really until I was right there in the middle of death row, realizing how close God was. Because many of these men have lost everything and their lives are literally on the line, and they've been waiting for a date, and even now I look back and I think about how my Advent has been blessed with this reflection that these men are always waiting for something. They're waiting for their next meal. They're waiting for the next phone call. Now they're waiting for their tablets to try to get approved so that they can have better communication with their loved ones. And some of them are waiting for their date, and some of them get it. Well, my whole encounter with death row, it was actually on Thursday. It was on Thursday. It was Ascension Thursday. And Bishop, when we got out, he said, "We're like the apostles going out and baptizing 2 by 2. And I was like, yeah, we are. And so we have mass in the general population, and he and I get back in the car and we look at each other, and I said, what the heck just happened? Because I didn't know what to expect, and I didn't really know what happened. So fast forward to August 16th. That was May 26th, I believe. August 16th, I drive back up to Polensky and Livingston for Kasul's final mass. His death date is August 17th. I'm there. We're in the same room together. He's shackled to a desk. And I purposely stand right across from him so that he can see a face of love. The mass was, to me, like in the upper room. It was his Last Supper. And the peace that I felt in that room, the gratitude that he shared afterwards, we were able to go and hug him. We were able to speak to him. I held him as I sang the song that our sisters sing at funerals, "May the angels lead you to paradise." And I drove over to Huntsville the next day. I was not in the execution chamber with him, but I was in the hospitality house with his family. And I'll never forget the very last, he was able to start making phone calls about 2:00 that afternoon. And I'll never forget about 4:30, his final phone call to his mother. Now, they were all from Laos. His sister spoke good English. His mother did not speak English well at all, but she understood. So there was a communication of presence for me with her. But I'll never forget his last phone call to his mother and how much she wept in anticipation of walking over in 30 minutes to go get prepared to watch her son die. And that whole experience for me changed how I see this ministry. For that one person, life ended. And how often we see that in our, we see one more person is up for the death penalty, but I now can understand a little bit better what it looks like, what the processes are. I didn't realize that even after the execution, a funeral home takes the body to a nearby church for a visitation of the family. I didn't realize that. But the humanity, the dignity that's given to the dead, the one who was just executed, and their family to have closure. And I didn't realize, but for about a month, I was really kind of messed up. I was anxious. I was not able to function well. I was kind of grouchy. I just couldn't put my finger on it. And then about 2 weeks later, I received this in the mail. Let me find it. Hang on. Where did it go? Well, hang on just a second. Can y'all see that?
Mm-hmm.
So this picture he sent to me about a month before he died. And this letter came to me. And as you can see, he wrote it that day of his final mass. And so on days that I get overwhelmed or frustrated, when volunteers aren't working well together, aren't cooperating, when chaplains are difficult to work with, when I just don't have enough hours in the day, I have this framed in my office and I keep it in a prominent place so that I remember why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
This ministry has changed me forever. I could sit here and give you a litany of all of the different things that I've done and what I've learned from them. But in reality, I will never be the same. And I thank God for that, because these men and women have helped me to see how to live a life of gratitude. They've helped me to love larger and deeper. And they've helped me to learn the compassion and the mercy for one another, because God gives that to me. And even though they are in prison, the only thing that's different is the clothes that we wear, because we have a lot of the same faults, a lot of the same struggles. And so right now I invite you, why do you stay in ministry? We're not necessarily asking for a litany of what you do or what you've done, but what is something that has changed you forever? What is a trait or a quality or something that you entered into this ministry with and now you live it in a different way? So I ask if you have something that you would like to share in community, something that was a challenge to you that has now turned into a blessing. We invite you to share that now as we look at our own ministries in whatever field, whatever way you've served. Keep it brief, minute or so, something so that as many people can share, want to share can share. So I ask you to just unmute yourself if you're ready and share a nugget of wisdom or blessing of why you are still in this ministry.
Hi, I'm Sister Barbara. I'm a medical mission sister in Philadelphia. And I started in the prison ministry about 9 years ago, and with a group called the Alternatives to Violence Project. It was started by some life prisoners in New York and some Quakers from Philadelphia. And we go in and we have workshops with the men. And every time I go, I feel like I'm on a retreat because we share, like just for an example, one thing that we shared was we went around the group and we're asking each one, how do you deal with difficult people? And for them, that might have been the guards even. So one guy who I know who's a Catholic, but he's out now, but he said, well, I try to see Christ in them. But then a few guys down is a guy that I don't think he was Catholic, and I don't really know if he's still there or not. But he said, I try to see them as God sees them.
That's powerful.
Thank you. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
In 1980, I accompanied a woman to court, and that was my ministry, to accompany women to court. She was from Cook County Jail, and she got life. Her name is Pearl, and Pearl became very sick. However, about 2 years ago, she was released. And my theory is that she was released because she was so sick and they didn't want to care for her. Anyway, Pearl now is in Los Angeles, and I keep in contact with her as I did all the years. And for me, she is so grateful for me keeping contact with her and for the sisters who pray for her. Some write, but her gratefulness, I don't have to send her material things. She's grateful for the prayers and the contact. So every bit counts.
Would anyone else like to share a golden nugget or a grace from your ministry?
I would, I'll just share a quick one. We don't have, in the federal system, we didn't have very many executions until the last 6 years, but we did have the execution of Timothy McVeigh. And I was new to Washington and had opted not to be involved in any abortions or in any executions because of the right to life. And so I found out, though, that the other chaplains went to be a part of the team at the execution, but there were no Catholics. And I found out that there was no Catholic, and I was told I didn't have a need to know. And I said, oh, but I do. And so I found out that there was no Catholic, and I called first I went to my boss, then I called the warden. And I said to the warden, I'm calling to tell you that Mr. McVeigh was raised a Catholic in a Catholic home. And he said, well, sister, he has no preference now. And I said, well, I'm here to tell you there are no atheists in foxholes. And he is very likely to ask for a priest at the last minute. He said, I already offered him a priest and he doesn't want one. And I said, well, I'm asking you to have one on hand. And he said to me in a rather curt way, he said, well, you're just going to have to trust me on that. So I said, okay, and went to my boss, who said, you're just going to have to trust him. So I was very concerned about it, but I couldn't. I also had opted not to be a part of the execution. So anyway, the morning after the execution, it was only 8 o'clock in the morning, my phone rang, and it was the warden. And he said, I called to thank you, because he said, I was haunted by your expression of that. He was not a Catholic. He said, I was haunted by your protection of his right as a Catholic up to the moment of his death. And he said, so I arranged to have a priest on hand. And he said, I walked the priest down to meet him. And the first thing he said is, Father, I want to go to confession and receive communion. So that is my only death row story. But at the same time, I feel like I made a right decision not to be involved. But it required a great deal of faith in the system for me to have that. I'm not sure I have that same faith in the system now that I had when I was working in it. But so that's my story. Don't get me started though, because I have a dozen more. So let's hear from some other people.
I could just say, well, these are wonderful sharings. And what I've found since COVID, we're allowed to just go with the glass and the phone. So there's a big glass separating. But generally, what I found with the inmates is the authenticity of their faith. And it's a type of authenticity that I don't normally see outside the prison. I mean, I do on occasion, but nothing like this. And to me, it's always inspiring. I'm more inspired, I think, than what I try to share with those I meet. So it's really the poverty of spirit. It really stands out. And the ability to see Christ in the inmate's eyes is what keeps me going. So just wanted to share that.
You.
I want to piggyback on what you just said, Bob, as far as I had a blessing of being able to go to the Conley unit in Texas in this last Monday. And they had not had any of the sacramental services since before COVID. So it was a very long Easter service on Our Lady of Guadalupe on her feast day. And the bishop, the gift of watching the volunteers, the regular volunteers come, and the interchange and the warmth and the blessing. And I'm so grateful to see so many times there was just a men's unit, but men blessing men. And I just feel like there's not that opportunity. They were never blessed, many of them never were blessed out on the outside. And you just see the blossoming and the growth that takes place, when just being hugged and touched. And the bishop was extremely generous with the oil on when he was confirming. And the men just kind of closed their eyes, and you could just see they were in ecstasy. It was just to be touched and to be blessed and to be anointed. So there's such a gift that you just really get, as you said, Bob, is you feel the Spirit so much stronger than you do at a large service full of people, but they just emote the gift of the Spirit, and it's a blessing for all of us that have that opportunity to witness it. And it just gives me energy to say, please come, more of you do prison ministry, because you will be changed and it will bless you and enrich you far more than you ever get. So it's such a gift. So I'm just always so grateful for every single person that comes on these calls and they're sharing. So thank you. Misty, your story was powerful.
I would like to say one more thing, and that is this hand. I'm hoping you can see my hand, and I'm wondering how many of you can remember the first time that an inmate matched your hand through the glass or through the, because it's such a common thing. So if you've experienced that, it'd be nice to see a head shaking or something where someone matches their hand, and it's their only, and sometimes it's through glass, but it's the closest they come to human contact. And so I guess that's my goodbye.
That human contact has become so powerful. One thing that made me weak in the knees again in death row was I looked up one time and our bishop had his finger in the gate and the inmate was holding on to it while he was asking them, where are you from? Who do you have in your family? What do you want me to pray for? And other times the inmate had their finger stuck out and he was holding on to their finger. And I thought, how powerful. It reminded me of a child and a parent's hand. But that grace of, I've not had the division with glass. I've always been in the midst of them. And the first time after COVID that our local prison had mass, I was in the back of a chapel full of about 75 men in white. I was in tears because I felt like that was the first time I had been to mass and I had experienced Christ in a very profound way, because these men had been without the Eucharist and without sacraments for 2 years. And this was their first mass back. And I'll just never forget, they were singing loud, they were joyful, everybody wanted to give everybody a hug at the sign of peace. And the gratitude that they shared was life-changing.
Thank you. Anyone else have a last word to offer before we close and just give you a little bit of just a sneak preview of what's coming in January?
Just thank you all for coming. It was a pleasure to spend the last hour with you, near and far. Have Father Gary. Good to see you again.
Yes, it was wonderful. And especially seeing an old friend that I ministered with in the 1970s. She just went off, but someone with whom I ministered in the Cook County Jail in the 1970s.
Well, thank you all for your ministry, and thank you all for sharing this time with us. It's definitely been a blessing, and we're so grateful in this season of remembering. And I know that you have a long list to pray for. The men that I was with, many of them coming up for parole, all asking for prayers. So if this time we lift up your good works and we lift up all of those that are hopefully will be able to experience a different kind of freedom, the exterior freedom, because they all are definitely free in spirit within, at least the ones we've been able to touch. So thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to close us out.
Sure. I just wanted to share some of our events in 2023 that'll be coming up. So in our first town hall of 2023, we will welcome Linda McFarland. She's the Executive Director of Just Detention International. And so she will share information with us so that we can gain an understanding of existing laws and how we can respond and walk with people who reveal these atrocities in confidence. In planning this town hall, Linda shared with us that over 200,000 people each year are being sexually abused in confinement in our U.S. correctional system. And she also told us that 50% of adults and 86% of juveniles are assaulted by adult correctional staff. And so we all are called to assist in changing legislation and enforcing laws that have been passed. And this town hall event will assist us in knowing more about this important topic. In January, our webinar will be, we're going to be welcoming 4 really talented people who are representatives of national Catholic organizations working for legislative change within the prison and detention system, and in working towards eliminating the death penalty. So our speakers include David Jimenez from Prison Fellowship, Emma Tacky from CMN, Tom Malloy from the Jesuit Conference of Canada and the United States, and then Christy Williams of Catholic Charities USA. And so this will be an opportunity for you to hear about the legislative focus for the year and to share input. And finally, we will offer 4 foundational training cohorts in the late winter and early spring of 2023. So if you or someone that you know is interested in joining one of these cohorts, we will offer 2 trainings geared toward adult ministry in English and 1 cohort in Spanish for adult ministry. And we're also piloting a cohort geared specifically towards ministry to juveniles. And so right now on the front page of our website, on our scroller, we have an interest form available, and our applications will be available soon. So from the team here at CPMC, we thank you all for joining us today, and we'd like to wish you and yours a Merry Christmas, and we look forward to seeing you in the new year. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.